Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The fragile peace that was established by the Treaty of Versailles really left countries ill-equipped to deal with the challenges and changes that was facing a modern Europe. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to characterize the governments that took power in Europe and Japan after World War I. And you should be able to describe the German wartime aggression towards its neighbors. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 12. Here I want to talk about how nationalism ended up gripping Europe and Asia. And I think it really begins with the question of the failed peace settlement after World War I. Because when settling World War I, President Wilson's goal was to secure a just and secure peace. But in reality, the Treaty of Versailles caused anger and resentment throughout Europe. Wilson had promised to make the world safe for democracy, but the democratic countries that emerged from the treaty had pretty limited experience with democracy and instead elected authoritarian leaders to go solve all of their problems. The dictators that arose end up seizing power from fragile democracies and leaving the countries to collapse. Take, for example, subpoint B of the Soviet Union. In 1922, Vladimir Lenin established the Soviet Union after the Civil War that had ousted and killed Tsar Nicholas, and then he established a communist country. In 1924, Joseph Stalin took over the Soviet Union, and he hoped to move the Soviet Union from a weak agricultural nation into a model communist country. He established a totalitarian state to do that, with almost complete control over people's lives, and he really suppressed all opposition. Stalin replaced the private farms with what was known as a collective farming, where farmers were basically lost their family farms, but the farm themselves was taken over by the government, and they continued to work the same land that their families had owned for years. Now it was a collective farm run by hundreds of families. And then, using a series of 5-year plans to direct industrialization, Stalin put all the economic activity in Russia under his control, and thus successfully created the world's second largest industrial power. But the human cost of this was tremendous. To consolidate and protect his power, Stalin purged anyone who threatened it, not even sparing his faithful supporters or close advisors. We'll never know for sure how many people Stalin killed or ordered the deaths of or died as a result of his policies, but most people consider it somewhere between 8 and 13 million people were killed in the Stalin purges. Also, the inefficient farming brought large-scale famines to regions of the Soviet Union and killing millions more, even beyond the actual purges, like just the mismanagement of the farms ended up leaving a lot of people starving to death. Some of them were accidental, most were accidental, some were deliberate. There was some intentional famine that was put on certain places that Stalin considered rebellious or undesirable. Historians will never know the exact number with certainty, but some people think that Stalin could be responsible for as many as 30 million deaths. Maybe as much as 150% of all the people that died in the whole of World War I. Subpoint C. The story changes a little bit in Italy. Although Italy had fought on the side of the Entente during the war, Italy's Prime Minister Vittoriano Orlando was muscled out of treaty negotiations, and Italy actually ended up losing land in the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. But they had paid for those losses dearly, with losing 650,000 soldiers in the war and almost another 600,000 civilians from famine and strife. Roughly 3% of the entire population of Italy died as a result of World War I, which is a tall price to pay for fighting on the winning side and yet losing land out of the deal. But the expense of fighting in World War I and the cost of losing the lands after the negotiations and the general disorganization of the Italian economy, it left the country drowning in debt, which they paid for by printing money and driving up inflation. The double hit of unemployment and inflation led to bitter strikes in the country, and some of which were communist-led, and it looked like the country was ripe for a communist rebellion there as well. Facing chaos, the upper and middle classes basically wanted stronger Italian leaders, such as Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a fascist, which is not communist. They're not usually related to each other. Mussolini was a fascist, which stresses nationalism and a country's needs over the needs of an individual. He played on the fears of economic collapse and the threats of communism to go take power. The symbol of fascism is the fasces. It was a bundle of rods tied around an axe handle, and it was one of the symbols of authority and power in ancient Rome. In October of 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome with thousands of followers in black uniforms, known as the black shirts of Italian fascism. They included important government officials and the police and the army who all sided with the fascists, and pushing Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III to go name Mussolini to be the head of government. So there would still be a king, but the king wouldn't directly rule over anything. In this case, they're naming Mussolini to become Il Duce. It's an Italian phrase. It means the leader. And as Il Duce, Mussolini promised to make the trains run on time, with fascism pervading all parts of Italian life. He promised to make the Mediterranean Sea into the old Roman lake and to rebuild the old Roman Empire, now in a modern model of Italy. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League of Nations responded with an economic boycott to try to punish Italy for doing so, but it was ultimately ineffective at stopping Italy. Subpoint D. Let us turn our eyes eastward towards Japan. The long story of Japan is that it's constantly in need of new resources. Japan is an island nation, 4 big islands, about 1,000 smaller islands around it, and a big population, and the islands have a hard time supporting the number of people on it. So needing more land and resources for its growing population in 1931, Japanese military leaders launched a surprise attack and seized Manchuria, a province of China. It's a resource-rich area of that country, about twice the size of Texas. The League of Nations also sees what's going on in Japan and says, oh, you can't do that either. And so they condemned the action, and even went as far as sending in representatives to Japan to go investigate the charge. The report that ensued condemned Japan and said it was an unrightful seizure of land, but the League of Nations was powerless to do anything about it. And in 1933, Japan ended up quitting the League, saying why would they belong to a league that wants to slap their hand? Inspired by the success of the takeover, the militarist faction of Japanese politics took control of the whole of Japan's government, and Japan turns more militaristic. Subpoint E. Here, let us turn our eyes back westward again and focus on Germany. Germany had long resented that they had to accept blame for World War I, that the Treaty of Versailles had forced them to take the blame for it. And also, Germany was upset that they had lost their colonies and that their border regions to their neighbors. And these were problems that overwhelmed the Weimar Republic, which was ruling over Germany. The Weimar Republic was seen as a type of a democratic country that could, democratic government that could rule over Germany. It was intentionally a weak government. People had just, didn't want to give Germany too much power after World War I. But it turns out that the Weimar Republic was almost too weak to govern itself. Adolf Hitler became the leader of a minor political party known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was better known by its nickname of the Nazi Party. Now, Hitler had one time served jail time for a failed political insurrection back in 1923, during which time he wrote a book known as Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is a German phrase. It means my struggle, where he explained that basically the basic beliefs of Nazism. Though the book had modest sales its first year, it did earn him enough money to go buy a Mercedes-Benz limousine while he was still in jail. Hitler wanted to unite all German-speaking people while enforcing racial purification to go rule over the world. People often think that the Aryan master race ideal is the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, ideal German child. But the Nazis actually put more emphasis on not being Jewish or Slavic than they did on, for instance, hair color. In particular, the Nazis talked an awful lot about Lebensraum. It's a German word. It means living room, just enough place to be. They preached that for Germany to thrive, Germany needed the fertile and resource-rich lands to which they felt they were entitled. And the only way for Germans to take that land, they argued, was by the might of a vicious sword. With a wrecked German economy, inflation-racked, and deeply indebted to the Treaty of Versailles reparations, and furthermore propped up by American loans and investments, at least until the U.S. Great Depression cut off the support, Germany had around 6 million unemployed people in 1932. Eager for work and inspired by Nazi propaganda, many men joined Hitler's private army. This group was known as the Brown Shirts, and they were also known by a German word that translates to stormtroopers. The stormtroopers' official role was to provide protection for Nazi political rallies and also to go cause havoc of their rival political parties. By mid-1932, the Nazis had become the strongest political party in Germany, and Hitler was named Chancellor of the country, essentially running the country of Germany. Once taking power, through totally constitutional means, he dismantled the democratic Weimar Republic and established Germany's Third Reich, its third empire. In doing so, Hitler tries to call on their own legacy of the Holy Roman Empire, which would be the First Reich, the Second Reich, which was that of Kaiser Wilhelm II in World War I, and now Hitler was proposing to lead the Third Reich under him. He said this would be a 1,000-year Reich, one that would last a millennium. Inspired by Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations, Hitler also quit the League of Nations in 1933. By fall of 1935, he built up his military in total defiance of the rules of the Treaty of Versailles. And then he sent that military into the Rhineland, a German region between France and Belgium, which had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, but remilitarized under Nazi leadership. Subpoint F. The Spanish Civil War was the result of decades-long economic conflict, also a military draft, and a lot of government corruption. There was basically a series of government crises, which are mostly outside of the scope of this class, but it brought out a military uprising. The Spanish Republic had basically ruled over Spain, but Francisco Franco was a general in the army and decided to go overthrow his own government to go do so, and so he led a military revolt against the Spanish Republic. The nationalists were led by Franco, and the nationalists were made up of Catholics, of military rebels, of landowners, of businessmen. It led to a pairing known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, which was an alliance with the fascists of Italy and the Nazis of Germany. And they were, considered like maybe the power holders or the people that had some authority in Spain. On the other hand, you had the Republicans, and these were mostly farm workers and urban workers and the educated middle class. They were aided by the Soviet Union, and though Western Europe and the United States officially remained neutral, a number of volunteers from Europe and the United States fought for the Republic on the side of these Republicans. Such limited aid, though, wasn't sufficient to go stop the spread of fascism. Although the Soviet Union sent in equipment and advisors, Hitler and Mussolini backed Francisco Franco's forces with troops and weapons and tanks and fighter planes. Soviet troops actually spent much of their energy, ended up fighting amongst themselves, with one side led by Stalin, another side by Trotsky. And so you have the Republican side with infighting, and the nationalist side with some major powers behind them. The Spanish Civil War was a cruel war. It's actually known in particular for its cruelty from both sides. Lawless Republican violence waged early in the war, and then nationalists ended up using terrorism to go cripple the Republican forces. The many executions and murders and assassinations on both sides reflected the passions of the war. In February of 1939, 500,000 Republican soldiers and civilians ended up fleeing across the border into France, and by the end of March of that year, Republican armies surrendered Madrid to nationalist forces. Deaths from the Spanish Civil War can only roughly be estimated. Historians have almost given up trying to count them. But modern research says that maybe as many as 500,000 died in the fighting, and that number doesn't include those who died from malnutrition, starvation, or war-caused disease. Franco's victory in 1939 established him as Spain's fascist dictator, another totalitarian government in Europe. Other countries saw the Spanish Civil War as part of an international conflict between tyranny and democracy, or fascism and freedom, or communism and civilization. For Germany and Italy, Spain was a testing ground for new methods of tank and air warfare. For Britain and France, the conflict was a threat to the peace they were struggling to preserve, which in 1939 was rapidly collapsing into World War II. The war also mobilized a number of artists and writers. Among the most artistic responses were the Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, and one of my favorites, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway, as well as Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica in 1937. Roman numeral number 13, fighting World War II. Subpoint A. Although Roosevelt was alarmed with the rise of fascism in Europe and Japan, he felt powerless to do anything about it. France and Great Britain had taken a policy of appeasement to give in to Germany on key issues in order to preserve the peace. Germany had taken over Austria. The majority of Austrians were ethnically German and favored unification, and people thought, well, if Germany takes over Austria, the Austrians think of themselves as German Italy. Anyway, Hitler wanted to go annex an area known as the Sudetenland, which was a mountainous region on the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. In the Sudetenland, there was 3 million German-speaking Czechs in order to create his, grab his more Lebensraum and for its resources. Hitler claimed that the Czechs were abusing the Sudeten Germans and amassed troops on the border. France and Great Britain had promised to go defend Czechoslovakia from the Nazis, but the Führer promised that Czechoslovakia would be his last territorial claim and that these Sudeten Germans really wanted to be a part of Germany anyway. Germany, France, and Great Britain signed the Munich Agreement of 1938, which peacefully handed over the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain pursued this policy of appeasement. Appeasement is giving up your principles to pacify an aggressor. I think of it as giving the lunch money to the school bully because it's better than getting beaten up. When he signed the Munich Agreement, Chamberlain announced to the British people, he says, "My friends, there has come back from Germany peace with honor." And he said, "I believe it is peace in our time." Winston Churchill was Chamberlain's political rival, and he condemned the appeasement policy, saying, "Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war." Churchill had long been suspicious of Hitler, but the other members of Parliament basically got tired of Churchill always, this constant fear-mongering, and the House of Commons ended up approving appeasement, and that the Munich Agreement was accepted. Then on March 15th of 1939, German troops poured into whatever remained of Czechoslovakia, even beyond the Sudetenland, to take over the rest of the country, and all of Czechoslovakia fell under the auspices of the Nazis in Germany. Subpoint B. At first, some Americans were actually supportive of Nazi Germany. It seemed like an answer to Soviet-style communism. Others saw Germany as an important trading partner. Take, for instance, Henry Ford. He never actually stopped producing cars in Germany, even during the hottest days of World War II. And late in the war, Ford factories even employed French prisoners of war as what was essentially slave labor. Many Americans were reluctant to get involved in international affairs because of the legacy of World War I, considering American involvement in the First War to be a mistake and just didn't want to go back into it again. And Congress seemed to be on their side, favoring isolationism. Starting in 1935, Congress passed a number of neutrality acts, a number of laws which outlawed arms sales or loans to nations at war. And this was in response to the fighting in Spain, and it was a response to the Civil War. They actually extended the ban to arms sales and loans to nations engaged in internal wars. So we didn't want to repeat the mistake that we made in World War I, where we were selling to both sides, but especially the Entente side. So if a country goes to war, then no arms sales from the United States. And if you're in a civil war, that also is ugly, and we're not going to sell to you then also. Subpoint C. By the spring of 1939, Hitler had taken the Sudetenland. He had taken over Austria. In both cases claimed that it was to bring together German-speaking people and to go fight for their rights. By spring of 1939, Hitler claimed that there were a number of German-speaking Poles in Poland, and they were mistreated by that country. Poland had a military alliance with France and Great Britain because they were suspicious of Hitler's Germany, but the other countries thought that Hitler was certainly bluffing. He would not go take Poland because if he did so, then Russia would absolutely go and defend Poland, and then Germany would end up with a two-front war with Russia on one side and France on another, and they just wouldn't do that again. It didn't go well for them in the First World War. They're certainly not going to go do it again. Then, on August 23rd of 1939, Stalin and Hitler surprised the world when they signed a non-aggression pact, saying that these two countries weren't going to go attack each other. Fascist Germany and communist Russia, they had been bitter enemies, but they fought on opposite sides during the Spanish Civil War, but this pact meant that they had a new relationship between the two countries. Secretly, they also signed another pact to go divide up Poland. They both were interested in that country. And with the danger now of a two-front war eliminated, Poland's fate was sealed. 1 week after announcing the Nazi-Soviet pact, Hitler overran Poland in what became known as his signature move, the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, where first came in the Luftwaffe German Air Force, raining bombs down on military bases and airfields and railroads and cities, and essentially trying to stop the target's ability to counterstrike before they ever get in there. And then, after that, the tanks race through the countryside, creating panic. Then the short, fast, powerful two-punch attack surrounds the enemy. It continuously changes the battlefront. It's basically impossible to defend against. The Blitzkrieg worked perfectly. Germany annexed western Poland with 2/3 of its population. The Soviet Union attacked and annexed eastern Poland. And by the end of September, Poland just ceased to exist. France and Great Britain predictably declared war on Germany, and we are now solidly into World War II. For several months, French and British soldiers settled in on a line between France and Germany known as the Maginot Line. There was a series of stationary defenses in order to keep Germany from going and invading France again. And here, this became known as the Sitzkrieg. It wasn't a blitzkrieg of a lightning war, it was a Sitzkrieg of a sitting war. The Maginot Line, that stationary defensive border, was similar to the trenches that defended France in the Great World War. Because both sides settled in but never actually fired a shot, newspapers started referring to it as a phony war. Both sides declared war, but nobody actually started fighting. Meanwhile, Stalin annexed Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. In late of 1939, Stalin attacked and captured Finland. And by spring of 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway. He said he wanted to protect those countries and their freedom and independence from the Soviet Union, which might have been some level of true, but he also built naval bases there to go launch attacks towards Great Britain, because Germany doesn't have much of a coastline. Then he captured the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg by the end of May of that year. Subpoint D. When Belgium falls, essentially the Maginot Line becomes worthless. Hitler just marched north around it and sent in German tanks through the vast Ardennes forest in northeast France. That allowed Hitler to go avoid the British and French troops, which were sitting down on the southern part of the border. They considered the Ardennes forest to be too thickly forested to be impassable, but of course they weren't figuring on tanks and airplanes. The British and French forces ended up back on their heels and were retreating while the Nazi forces were advancing. And they essentially got trapped with their backs to the English Channel. But in less than a week, in June of 1940, a makeshift fleet of 800 fishing boats and tugboats and river barges and pleasure yachts, they ended up ferrying 330,000 British, French, and Belgian troops safely across the channel. In what's known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, they saved essentially all of the soldiers. They did lose pretty much all of the heavy equipment, had to be abandoned to the Nazis though. Later that month, Italy invaded France from the south. They entered the war on the side of the Nazis while Germans marched towards Paris. And in June 22nd of 1940, Hitler handed the French officers the terms of surrender. These terms of surrender meant that Germany was going to occupy northern France. They took it over and ran it directly as just now Nazi France. The southern part of France was more sparsely populated, and while the Nazis probably would have liked to have taken it too, it would have been harder to take. So what they do there is establish a puppet government. Essentially, they split off southern France, and they say, you're going to be a new country now. You have a new capital. It's no longer Paris. That belongs to the Nazis. But you have a capital in the city known as Vichy. And so sometimes you'll hear this, the southern part of France in World War II referred to as Vichy France. The Vichy government was ostensibly an independent country, but in reality was a puppet of the Nazis and was almost directly controlled by them. The French general, Charles de Gaulle, he fled to England and set up a new government. He called it the government in exile, or essentially, we're the rightful government of France. We're just not currently in France because we're being occupied or directed by the Nazis. So the government in exile, claiming to be the rightful French government. He famously said that France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. He organized a group known as the Free French Forces, which pledged to fight Hitler's occupation. They and a group of guerrilla fighters known as the Maquis were from Vichy. They led daring attacks against their German occupiers. Subpoint E. And then the battle turns towards Great Britain. In the summer of 1940, Germany had assembled an invasion fleet along the French coast with plans to invade Great Britain. Germany had also planned an air assault because its navy couldn't compete with Britain's. It's worth noting that the British Army was one of the finest in the world, which makes sense because it's an island country, but their army wasn't known as being particularly spectacular. On the other hand, the Germans had it quite the opposite. The German army was considered among the best in the world, but the German navy relied on U-boats, but otherwise wasn't a major force, which again makes sense because Germany is not quite, but mostly a landlocked country. Germany did, though, have a stronger air force, the Luftwaffe. But what's known as the Battle of Britain, German planes bombed British targets. By this point, Churchill had been named prime minister. People had essentially lost confidence in Chamberlain. They said, you're supposed to bring peace in our time, and instead what you did was just embolden Hitler. So they gave up on Chamberlain and said, turns out Churchill was right the whole time, made him prime minister, and they began preparing for Germany's impending attack. In July, Germany flew bombing runs over Great Britain, hoping to gain control over the island's skies by totally destroying the Royal Air Force. The Nazis had 2,600 planes, 2,000 of which were all employed entirely on Great Britain, flying routes over the country. First, they were targeting airfields, trying to stop the Royal Air Force from fighting back. Then the Luftwaffe spread out to targeting cities. And every night, for 2 months in a row, every night, London was bombed. For nearly 2 years, Britain fought Germany essentially alone. The French were unable to go fight back, and nobody else had their back. The British did have an advantage, though. The newly invented technology of radar was used to track down Nazi aircraft in the darkness, and then they scrambled the Royal Air Force to go shoot down German planes. And it was so effective that the Royal Air Force had stymied the German Luftwaffe, so much so that Hitler called off the invasion, said maybe we'll focus on other targets. That was a huge effort for the Royal Air Force in defending the country, of which Churchill praised his Air Force, saying, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The increasing daringness of the Nazis, the challenge to the peace of Europe, all of these things don't directly involve the United States, but they will soon, in a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.